Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for tuning in this evening for our online Bible study. Let's get into it. I welcome you. If you are new to the study, I'm Pastor Dave St. Aubin, and it's a joy to be with you here this evening. Tonight, we will be looking at the book of Lamentations, chapter 4. So I invite you to grab your Bibles, open them up to Lamentations, chapter 4, grab something to take some good notes with, grab a beverage, and grab a snack, and let's get into it. Well, again, good evening and welcome, and thanks for tuning in. I do pray that your day has been going well. Pray that your week's been going well so far. I welcome you. Appreciate you being here. I hope that wherever you are, your weather has been cooperative. Beautiful day here in Nebraska, and so wherever you're joining from, I appreciate you being here and taking time out in your evening to go through this study together, our journey through the Bible, one chapter at a time. We've made it now into the fourth chapter of the book of Lamentations, only 5 chapters in this short book, so we will be concluding Lamentations tomorrow, but we've been looking at these individual laments for throughout the last few nights, and tonight we come to this fourth lament, and this is the focus is on the anger of God. This fourth lament is very similar to chapter 2, in that they both describe God's judgment of Jerusalem and of Judah. And as what we saw within the first 3 chapters, there's 2 voices that are found here in chapter 4. The narrator, that voice appears in verses 1 through 16 and 21 and 22. And then the voice of the people appears in verses 17 through 20. So it is very similar to the first 3 chapters of the book of Lamentations, but in other respects, it's also very different. This is a considerably shorter lament, much shorter than what we saw in chapter 3 last night. Each of the stanzas in this poem is divided into 2 rather than 3 lines. There's no prayer to God in this chapter, who is really only referred to in the third person. And this lament differs in that it ends on note of assurance, and we will see that in verse 22. But the first 11 verses here, they focus on the conditions of Jerusalem, of Judah, during the siege by the Babylonians. So this dark section, verses 1 through 11, of this fourth lament, it contains 2 parallel parts, verses 1 through 6 and verses 7 through 11. The people of Judah had become despised, and the children and the adults, in other words, everyone, suffered. And so those are the parallel parts, that there's the people are despised and they all suffered. And all of this calamity was the result of God's punishment for their sins, which is what we've been looking at throughout the book of Jeremiah and these first couple chapters in Lamentations. And we will see that again tonight. So a shorter chapter tonight, shorter study, but still lots to look at here. So let's get right into it. Open up your Bibles to Lamentations chapter 4. And if you don't have a Bible with you, not a problem. As always, we put all the verses up here on the screen for you. You can follow along, take some good notes, and let's begin with verse 1. How the gold has lost its luster. The fine gold becomes dull. The sacred gems are scattered at every street corner. So already we have imagery. And this lament resumes this characteristic that we saw in chapter 1 and chapter 2. It begins with how, or in a better translation, the word alas. We saw that again in the first 2 laments. And here it returns. But this imagery of gold and stones It is imagery, but it's also literal in the sense that the gold and the precious stones that had decorated the temple no longer served any function. The gold was now dirty because it was in the dirt, the dust of the ground. The gems had been torn out of their mountings. We saw that a couple chapters ago. Verse 2. And how the precious children of Zion. So here's the imagery of the jewels, that it's a reference to the children, once worth their weight in gold. They are now considered as pots of clay, the work of a potter's hand. So Jeremiah is comparing the precious inhabitants of Jerusalem, not just the children, but the children of God, comparing them to gold, comparing them to gems, and now they all lay in the streets of the city. They are defiled, they are dead. And the enemy had regarded the citizens of Jerusalem, who were more valuable than gold. The enemy really regards the Israelites as nothing more than just earthenware pots. And the Babylonians had smashed many of those pots, just destroyed them. Now, in this time in history, these earthenware jars, this pottery, they were almost worthless. They had very little value to them. And so if they were broken, they were just disregarded. They would be replaced. And that's what's happening here with the people of Jerusalem. Verse 3. And even the jackals offer their breasts to nurse their young. But my people have become heartless like ostriches in the desert. So the horrors of this siege of Jerusalem had turned the once compassionate women of Jerusalem, of Judah, turned them into selfish individuals who were unwilling to give of themselves for the welfare of their young. That's what that first part of verse 3 means. And like ostriches that don't care for their offspring, these women were the same way. They had abandoned, in some case even eaten, their children. They had become and behaved worse than these loathsome jackals, but at least the jackals nursed their young. The women here had completely abandoned their children. The children were suffering because of the sins of the parents. Verse 4. Because of thirst, the infant's tongue sticks to the roof of its mouth. The children beg for bread, but no one gives it to them. So even the infants in Jerusalem during this siege, even they didn't have enough to drink or to eat, because there was such a famine that the parents were just taking what little food there was and consuming it themselves to meet their own needs. They were neglecting the children. These infants were so weak from starvation, they no longer could even cry in their hunger. That's what verse 4 is saying. Even they couldn't shed any more tears. Verse 5. Those who once ate delicacies are now destitute in the streets. Those brought up in royal purple, now they lie in ash heaps. So the rich in Jerusalem, who were once accustomed to eating these delicacies, now even they have to try to survive by just finding anything they can eat at all, usually lying in the street. The royal among them, the wealthy among them, the people who would wear purple, which was a sign of royalty, now they all have to resort to eating garbage for food. Verse 6. The punishment of my people is greater than that of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, without a hand turned to help her. So Jerusalem's sin and punishment for that sin, both were greater than Sodom's sin and Sodom's punishment, because God overthrew Sodom quickly. But Jerusalem, this siege of Jerusalem, this lasted a year and a half. And Jerusalem was not they were more sinful not because of the extreme sexual sin, which was what the sin of Sodom was. They were more sinful because of their extreme covenant unfaithfulness. At times, those two things merge, unfaithfulness and extreme sexual sin. But for Sodom, it was sexual sin. For Jerusalem, it was their unfaithfulness to God's covenant. And the meaning of the words here in this verse, no hands were turned toward or no hands were wrung over. The meaning of those words is really unclear. It could mean that no one came to Jerusalem's aid during the time of the siege. It could mean that people who were looking at this event taking place, that they didn't mourn the siege of Jerusalem. What it probably means is that no human enemy subjected Sodom to a long siege. It was over almost immediately. But a human army did take a long time for their siege on Jerusalem, the Babylonians, which took 18 months, and that was much, much worse than what happened to Sodom. Verse 7. Now we see this second description of the conditions during the siege. So verse 7. Their princes were brighter than snow and whiter than milk, their bodies more ruddy than rubies, their appearance like lapis lazuli, but now they are blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become as dry as a stick. Some of the residents had dedicated themselves to the Lord. And they were of the highest quality people, but even they had become victims of the siege, and they had suffered terribly, along with all the ordinary citizens. And what this is saying is their fine complexions, their healthy bodies, had now become black and shriveled. And this chapter is one of the most graphic in the book of Lamentations in describing the physical suffering of the people of Jerusalem, right? This is a description of their physical suffering. And what makes it especially vivid is the use of color here. In fact, color is one of the striking features of this chapter. Verses 1 and 2 and verse 5, gold and scarlet and white and red and sapphire in verses 7 and 8, and now black. The bright colors, gold and scarlet and white, red, sapphire, they represent the earlier conditions. But as the famine progresses, the colors are erased from the picture, and all that remains is the dullness, the blackness. Very vivid description of physical suffering taking place. Verse 9. Those who were killed by the sword are better off than those who die of famine. Racked with hunger, they waste away for lack of food from the field. So some of the people died in battle. Some of them starved to death. Those who had died in battle by the sword were more fortunate because a swift death, at least in this case, was much better than a gradual death of starving to death. Verse 10. With their own hands, compassionate women have cooked their own children, who became their food when my people were destroyed. So, again, these previously compassionate women had to resort to boiling their own children and eating them to sustain their own lives during the rigors of the siege, this extreme famine. And the really sick irony here is that the children were the means by which the women would survive into the future by caring for their mothers as they got older, right? But in order to survive, the mothers had to resort to eating their own. And we have to at least assume here that these mothers only ate the children who had already died. But Even if that were the case, it's hard to imagine a more shocking, sickening image as to having to eat one's own young to stay alive. And that really serves as a climax to the description of this extreme famine in verses 1 through 10. So, again, very vivid imagery here of the results of this attack, this punishment, this siege on Jerusalem, and this horrible famine that you would have been better off just being killed in battle. Now you're left to rot away for lack of nutrition, lack of food. Verses 11 through 20 shift focus now onto the cause of this siege. So Jeremiah now turns from the suffering to the source of the suffering. Verse 11, the Lord has given full vent to his wrath. He has poured out his fierce anger. He kindled a fire in Zion that consumed her foundations. God had executed his wrath by punishing Jerusalem. And like a fire, his anger burned among the people. And ironically, he consumed the city with fire. Now, even though the Babylonians were instrumental in the destruction of the city, it was God who was the cause of this. It was because of God's anger. Now, we have to think, because the foundations of the city and the temple, they were stone, right? And you can't burn away stone. So fire consuming the foundations is most likely hyperbole. But what it more probable represents is reference to the human foundations of the city. In other words, the leading citizens of the city were the foundation, and they were destroyed and burned away. Verse 12, the kings of the earth did not believe, nor did any of the peoples of the world, that the enemies and foes could enter the gates of Jerusalem. We looked at this throughout the book of Jeremiah. This overthrow of Jerusalem surprised everybody. Surprised the leaders, surprised the people, surprised the other nations. These invaders from Babylon had forced their way into the city. In the past, there had been other invaders of Jerusalem, but the citizens had always fought them off and rebuilt and re-strengthened their defenses. But this time, this city, which to the people appeared to be impregnable, fell. And it shocked everybody. Jerusalem's fall in 586 BC, it exposed this false assurance that illustrates this theological truth of Scripture. And that truth is this: sinful, rebellious people, even if they are outwardly associated with the covenant community, should never presume on the protection of God. And that's what these people were doing. They were saying what we saw in the book of Jeremiah is, well, God would never do that to us. This is his city. This is his temple. God would never destroy this place. And they had this false assurance just because they knew God and believed of God that this would never happen. But it did, and it shocked everybody. Verse 13. But it happened. Why did it happen? Because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed within her the blood of righteousness, or the blood of the righteous. So this overthrow of Jerusalem came because of the religious leaders who were represented by the priests and the false prophets who had perverted justice. They had forsaken the covenant of the Lord. They had persecuted their brothers and sisters. They even put people to death who didn't deserve it. And we saw that in the book of Jeremiah, including one of Jeremiah's closest associates, so to speak, Uriah. Uriah was put to death, Jeremiah 26. So this is the cause for all this. Verse 14, and now they grope through the streets as if they were blind. They are so defiled with blood that no one dares to touch their garments. Some of these spiritually blind leaders had apparently lost their physical eyesight during the siege, and they had to wander the streets blind now. They had shed innocent blood. Now, blood had shed their garments. And instead of being resources for the people during the siege, they became individuals to avoid because of their uncleanness. Verse 15, go away. You are unclean, people cry to them. Away, away, don't touch us. And when they flee and wander about, people among the nations say they can no longer stay here. So they were like lepers, these leaders. And they had to warn others to stay away. In the book of Leviticus 13, that's what the leper had to do. If you started to come close, the leper had to say, unclean, right? I am unclean, stay away. So these leaders had to do this. I am unclean, and they had wandered away from their own people. Even the pagans didn't want them living among them. They had nowhere to go. And so just as these false prophets and these false leaders who had led people astray, just as they had wandered blind with this infatuation to pagan Baal worship, and their idolatry, just as they had wandered blind, now they must wander blind among everybody in this calamity. Verse 16, the Lord himself has scattered them. He no longer watches over them. That's harsh. The priests are shown no honor. The elders are shown no favor. The presence of God scattered these leaders because he no longer had regard for them. And as a consequence, these other nations would also show no respect or regard for their presence among them. Nobody wanted them. They had failed to honor those who should have received honor in Judah. The true priests, the true elders, the true prophets. And now it's all come around full circle. Verse 17, and moreover, our eyes failed, looking in vain for help. From our towers we watched for a nation that could not save us. This goes back to their trust in other nations to help them. The people of Jerusalem had looked for help to come from somewhere to save them, but that help never came. They were either looking for help from people or from other nations. They had this expectation that the Egyptians would come in to help them, or the Assyrians would come in to help them, or somebody, and even God would not help them. Verse 18, people stalked us at every step, so we couldn't even walk our streets. Our end was near, our days were numbered, and now for our end has come. People stalked us refers to the Babylonians. And this is really the first reference to the enemies of Israel in this part of the book. The residents of Jerusalem couldn't even walk their streets of their city because of the danger of the Babylonians during this great siege. And after the walls were breached, they all knew their end was very near, right? There was no going back. Verse 19, our pursuers were swifter than eagles in the sky. They chased us over the mountains. They lay in wait for us in the desert. Judah's enemies came in and leveled the cities of Jerusalem. And then as the people fled, these enemies swiftly pursued them out into the countryside. They weren't going to allow any of the Israelites to escape. They chased them. The Babylonians chased them wherever they tried to hide, in the mountains, in the wilderness, in the caves. The Babylonians hunted them down like an eagle pursuing its prey. Verse 20, and the Lord's anointed, our very life breath, was caught in their traps. We thought that under his shadow we would live among the nations. So the enemy here, the Babylonians, had even captured Zedekiah. That's the Lord's anointed, our very life breath. So even he was captured. And the people of Judah had evidently hoped to live under the authority of Zedekiah while in captivity. But now Zedekiah, remember, had been blinded and he's left to die in prison. So this section was all about the reasons for the siege, and it gives three causes: the sins of the priests and the prophets, verses 13 through 16, reliance on these foreign allies, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, whoever, verses 17 through 19, and so that Zedekiah could be captured. That was another cause for the siege, was that their king would be taken into not just captivity, but into prison to die there. But these last two verses, very, very unique, right? They come right out of the blue. The tone of chapter 4 has been to focus on this absolutely dire situation in Jerusalem. And by verse 20, the reader is left with this distinct feeling that the end has come. We just saw that. We knew our time was near, but now out of nowhere comes what has this feel of this prophetic oracle proclaiming divine judgment on the Edomites for their treatment of the Israelites. So verse 21, so we just saw this doom and gloom and the end is near, but verse 21, rejoice, be glad, daughter Edom, you who live in the land of Uz, but to you also the cup will be passed, and you too will be drunk and stripped naked. So the Edomites are brought into this. Now, who are the Edomites? They were ancestrally related to the people of Judah through Esau, Jacob's brother, right? So out of the line of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob came the Israelites. Out of the line of Esau, Jacob's brother, came the Edomites. The Edomites rejoiced over the destruction of Judah. But what this verse is saying is, now that same fate is about to come to you, Edom, and you too are going to have to drink the cup of God's wrath, God's judgment, and you too are now going to lose your self-control. The land of Uz, which was the country of Job, when we looked at the book of Job, this in a sense is another name for Edom. So Edom here isn't necessarily just the Edomites. Edom, in another sense, is personifying all of Israel's enemies. So, in other words, all you who rejoiced over our destruction, it's coming to you next. Verse 22, and your punishment will end, daughter Zion. So here's the flip. He will not prolong your exile, speaking of God, but he will punish your sin, daughter Edom, and he will expose your wickedness, Edom. So Jerusalem's punishment had come, and that punishment had reached an end in terms of it continuing to happen. They were in exile, but the greater punishment had stopped. Now they were in exile. But that exile was not going to last forever. But for the Edomites, for those enemies of God, God was still going to punish them. Israel and Edom were about to swap places. Jerusalem, the people of Zion, they had drunk from God's cup of wrath. Now, Edom was going to drink from God's cup of wrath. Jerusalem had been stripped bare. Now Edom would be stripped bare. The punishment for Jerusalem had been completed. The punishment for Edom was just getting started. And it's very significant. The last Hebrew word in this fourth lament is tam, which we could spell T-A-M in the English. But that word tam means completed. This punishment has been completed. In other words, the prayers of the people of Jerusalem, the exiles, are now going to be answered. And this closing note of certainty, to this bright future to come for the Israelites is really remarkable for us, the reader, who have read this far in the book. Because everything we've seen up to this point has been devastation, but now we see the hope to come. So this part of chapter 4 it brings a message of hope, but it's also just an interlude. It's the eye of the hurricane. It's just a calm point in the midst of the storm, because what we're going to see tomorrow in Lamentations chapter 5, this fifth poem, is that once again we find ourselves in the midst of questions, in the midst of doubts, in the midst of confusion in this great calamity. But that is Lamentations chapter 4. I pray that has been a help to you, and go back and reread these laments. And my prayer is that you have a better understanding as we go through these classes together. Tomorrow we will conclude the book of Lamentations. We'll look at the fifth lament, which is the response of the godly to all this. And that will conclude Lamentations, and we'll prepare on Monday to move into the book of Ezekiel. But thank you for being here tonight. I pray that you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Till then, take care, and God bless. Bye-bye.